The rain hammered against the funeral home windows as Margaret Chin sat alone in the front row, her black dress still damp from the graveside service. At 62, she looked smaller somehow, diminished by grief and the overwhelming presence of her late husband David's family filling the chairs behind her. The hushed conversations weren't quite hushed enough. Before we continue with Margaret's story, I'm curious where you're watching from today. Whether you're dealing with your own difficult family dynamics or just need a story about justice being served, drop a comment and let me know your location. Now back to Margaret's moment of truth. Eleanor Walsh, David's mother, leaned toward her sister Patricia with barely concealed satisfaction. "She's finally alone now," Eleanor whispered, her voice carrying the particular cruelty that comes with years of practiced disdain. "No more pretending we have to include her in family decisions." Patricia nodded knowingly, her eyes scanning Margaret's slight frame with obvious calculation. "The house was always meant for family," she murmured back. "Real family." Harold Walsh, David's father, stood near the memorial display adjusting his expensive tie with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. At 70, he still commanded attention in any room, his silver hair perfectly styled and his navy suit impeccably tailored. He'd built a successful construction business from nothing, and he'd raised his son to understand the value of keeping assets within the bloodline. David had been gone only 3 days, but Harold's mind was already working through the practical matters that needed immediate attention. Margaret heard every word. 25 years of marriage to David had taught her to listen carefully when the Walsh family spoke in their coded language of belonging and exclusion. She learned early that her Chinese-American background made her an outsider in their Irish Catholic dynasty, despite her master's degree in finance and her fluent English that had no trace of an accent. To them, she would always be David's foreign wife, the woman who'd somehow captured their golden boy's attention but never truly earned their acceptance. She clutched her small black purse tighter, feeling the weight of the documents inside. Papers she'd kept organized and updated throughout her marriage, filed away in the safety deposit box that only she could access. Margaret had always been methodical about important things, a habit that had served her well in her career before David convinced her to focus on supporting his ambitions instead. The funeral director approached with practiced sympathy, speaking in the gentle tones reserved for fresh widows. "Mrs. Walsh," he said quietly, "we'll be closing the viewing room in 30 minutes. Margaret nodded gratefully, but Eleanor's sharp voice cut through the moment like a blade. "Actually," she corrected with cold authority, "she's Mrs. Chun. She never legally changed her name. You know, some people don't understand the importance of commitment to family traditions." Margaret's hands remained steady in her lap, though her knuckles had gone white. She'd heard variations of this particular cruelty for over 2 decades. The implication that keeping her family name somehow proved her disloyalty or her failure to fully integrate into the Walsh legacy. What Eleanor didn't know, what none of them knew, was exactly why Margaret had been so careful about legal names and documentation throughout her marriage. Harold moved closer to his wife, his voice dropping to what he believed was a private volume. "We need to discuss the house situation soon," he said to Eleanor. "David never updated his will after the refinancing last year. Margaret's going to need guidance about transitioning to something more appropriate for her circumstances." The way he emphasized appropriate made it clear he'd already decided what those circumstances should be. Patricia chimed in with false concern, coding her words like honey over poison. Poor Margaret's probably overwhelmed by all the financial complexity. She never really understood David's business dealings anyway. It's better if family handles these matters. She'll be much happier in a smaller place, somewhere she can manage on her own. Margaret continued to sit quietly, her dark eyes focused on the flower arrangements surrounding David's photograph. 25 years of building a life together, of supporting his dreams and ambitions, of managing the details that allowed him to focus on growing his consulting practice. 25 years of careful planning and meticulous record-keeping that the Walsh family had never bothered to notice or understand. Eleanor stood abruptly, smoothing her black skirt with the sharp movements of a woman accustomed to taking charge. "Margaret, dear," she said with false warmth, "we should probably discuss some practical matters soon. Tomorrow might be appropriate. The house has so many memories tied to our family, and I'm sure you'll want to start fresh somewhere that feels more like home to you." Margaret finally looked up, her expression serene despite the storm building around her. "Of course, Eleanor," she replied softly. "Tomorrow would be fine. We should definitely discuss the house. There are quite a few things about it that might surprise you." Something in Margaret's tone made Harold pause mid-conversation with his brother. A subtle note of confidence that didn't match the grieving widow image they'd constructed in their minds. But the moment passed quickly, lost in the shuffle of family members gathering coats and making plans for the reception. As the room emptied, Margaret remained in her chair for a few more minutes, saying a private goodbye to the man she'd loved despite his family's endless campaign to diminish her place in his life. David had never stood up to them, had never forced them to acknowledge her contributions or respect her intelligence. He'd taken the path of least resistance, asking her to understand their old-fashioned ways rather than demanding they adjust to modern reality. But Margaret had never been passive, despite appearances. She'd simply been patient, building something they couldn't see while they focused on maintaining their illusions of control. Tomorrow's conversation would reveal just how carefully she'd been planning for a day she'd hoped would never come. The rain had stopped by the time she walked to her car, but the Walsh family was already clustering near their vehicles, their voices carrying across the parking lot as they made plans for dividing up David's legacy. They spoke about her as though she weren't there, as though she were already a problem solved rather than a person to be reckoned with. Margaret started her car and pulled away slowly, watching them in her rearview mirror. She had documents to review tonight, phone calls to make, and preparations to complete. 25 years of careful planning was about to pay dividends that would leave the Walsh family speechless. The house they considered their family property was indeed about to change hands. But not in the way they expected. The doorbell rang at exactly 9 o'clock the next morning, followed immediately by the sound of Harold's key turning in the lock. Margaret was still in her robe, nursing her first cup of coffee in the kitchen she designed herself when David finally agreed to renovate 5 years ago. The Walsh family entered like they owned the place, which in their minds, they absolutely did. Eleanor swept through the foyer carrying a stack of empty moving boxes, her heels clicking against the hardwood floors with military precision. She dressed for business today in a charcoal gray suit that made her look like a corporate executioner. Behind her, Harold wheeled in a dolly loaded with more boxes, his movements efficient and purposeful. Patricia brought up the rear with her husband Frank, both of them scanning the house with the calculating eyes of appraisers. "Margaret," Eleanor called out in a voice that carried throughout the house, "we're here to help you pack. I know this is overwhelming, but we thought it would be easier if we all worked together to sort through everything." She emphasized the word everything with the kind of authority that suggested the sorting had already been decided. Harold found Margaret in the kitchen and nodded curtly, his expression mixing false sympathy with barely concealed impatience. "Margaret," he said, settling his bulk into one of the kitchen chairs without invitation, "we need to discuss the timeline here. I've spoken with our attorney, and there are some complications with David's estate that require immediate action. The house situation needs to be resolved quickly to avoid any legal issues." Margaret set down her coffee cup carefully, her movements calm despite the invasion unfolding around her. "What kind of complications?" she asked quietly, though her tone suggested she might already know more than Harold expected. Eleanor appeared in the kitchen doorway, having already begun her inventory of the living room. "The problem," she explained with exaggerated patience, "is that David never properly updated his estate planning after the last refinancing. The house has always been considered family property, built with Walsh family money and intended for Walsh family use. You're going to need somewhere more suitable for your situation anyway." Patricia joined the conversation from the dining room, where she was examining the china cabinet. "This house is really too large for one person," she called out helpfully, "and the maintenance costs alone would be overwhelming on whatever David's life insurance provides. It's better for everyone if we handle the property transition properly." Margaret listened to the three of them orchestrate her displacement with the smooth efficiency of people who discussed this scenario many times before. They spoke about her future as though she were a child incapable of making her own decisions, their voices filled with the particular condescension reserved for people they considered fundamentally inferior. Harold pulled out a folder from his briefcase and spread several documents across the kitchen table. "Now, the mortgage situation is complex," he continued, putting on reading glasses that made him look even more authoritative. When David refinanced 3 years ago, there were some irregularities in how the paperwork was handled. Our family attorney has identified several areas where your legal position might be, shall we say, uncertain. Eleanor returned from her living room inspection carrying a small ceramic vase that Margaret's grandmother had given her as a wedding gift. "This is lovely," she said, turning it over to examine the bottom. "Very delicate. Chinese, I assume? These kinds of ethnic pieces can be quite valuable to collectors who appreciate that sort of thing. You'll probably want to take special care with items that have personal meaning from your background." The dismissal was expertly delivered, wrapped in false concern but clearly designed to categorize Margaret's most precious possessions as foreign curiosities rather than family heirlooms. Margaret watched Eleanor handle the vase with the careless confidence of someone who'd already decided its fate. Frank emerged from his inspection of the basement carrying a small notebook where he'd apparently been cataloging items. "Harold," he said, "that workshop downstairs has some serious equipment. The table saw alone is probably worth $3,000, and there's a full set of professional woodworking tools. David must have spent a fortune setting that up." Harold nodded knowingly. Dad always said David inherited the family talent for working with his hands. That workshop represents years of investment in quality equipment. It would be criminal to let those tools sit unused when they could benefit someone who'd actually use them properly. Margaret felt something cold settle in her chest. The workshop had been her gift to David for their 20th anniversary. She'd researched every tool, every piece of equipment, spending months learning about woodworking so she could create the perfect space for the hobby he'd always dreamed of pursuing. The receipts were still filed in her office upstairs, along with the credit card statements showing exactly who had paid for every item. Patricia emerged from the master bedroom, carrying an armload of David's suits. "Eleanor," she announced, "these need to be handled carefully. Some of these are custom-tailored, probably worth thousands. Harold Jr. would fit most of them perfectly with minimal alterations. It seems wasteful to donate them when family could benefit." Eleanor nodded approvingly while examining a silk tie that Margaret had bought David for his last birthday. "The family has always believed in keeping quality items within the family," she said, glancing meaningfully at Margaret. David understood that certain things represent more than just monetary value. They represent legacy and tradition. Margaret stood quietly in her kitchen, surrounded by people dismantling her life with the casual efficiency of professional movers. They discussed her possessions as though she'd already agreed to surrender them, their voices mixing entitlement with false generosity as they decided which items deserved to stay within the Walsh family circle. The doorbell rang again, and Harold smiled with satisfaction. "That'll be Robert Morrison, our family attorney," he announced. "I asked him to stop by to help explain the legal complexities. Sometimes these situations are easier to understand when a professional walks you through the details." Robert Morrison entered like a man accustomed to delivering bad news with practiced sympathy. He was younger than Margaret had expected, probably in his 40s, with the kind of expensive haircut and perfectly pressed suit that suggested his services didn't come cheap. His handshake was firm but brief, his eyes already scanning the house with professional assessment. "Mrs. Chun," he said, settling into the chair Harold indicated, "I've reviewed the preliminary documentation, and there are several areas where we need clarification. The property ownership situation is more complex than it initially appeared." He opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. When David refinanced the property, there were some irregularities in the documentation that create potential complications for the estate. Margaret poured herself another cup of coffee, her movements deliberate and calm. "What kind of irregularities?" she asked, though something in her tone suggested she might already know exactly what irregularities he was referring to. Morrison glanced at Harold before continuing, clearly uncomfortable with the level of detail he was being asked to provide. "Well, there appear to be some questions about the source of the down payment for the original purchase, and the refinancing documents don't clearly establish the chain of ownership that would typically be expected in a family property situation." Eleanor set down Margaret's grandmother's vase with slightly less confidence than she'd shown earlier. "What exactly does that mean for the transition timeline?" she asked, her voice carrying the first hint of uncertainty Margaret had heard all morning. Margaret walked to the window and looked out at the garden she'd spent 15 years cultivating, the rose bushes she'd planted to remind her of her childhood home, the fruit trees that were just beginning to show the first buds of spring. Behind her, the Walsh family continued their discussion of legal complexities and transition timelines, but their voices had lost some of their earlier certainty. "Actually," Margaret said quietly, still facing the window, "I think there might be some documents you should see before we go any further with these plans." She turned back to face the room, her dark eyes meeting Morrison's with a directness that made him shift uncomfortably in his chair. "There are some files upstairs that might clarify those irregularities you mentioned." Harold frowned, his confidence wavering slightly. "What kind of files?" he demanded, though his tone had lost some of its earlier authority. Margaret smiled for the first time since they'd arrived, a small expression that somehow managed to change the entire atmosphere in the room. "Financial records," she said simply. "Documentation about the house purchase and refinancing. I've always been very careful about keeping thorough records of important transactions." The silence that followed lasted just a moment too long, and in that silence, something fundamental shifted in the kitchen. Morrison cleared his throat and looked at his folder with newfound uncertainty. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "we should review any additional documentation before proceeding with the current plan." Margaret nodded graciously, as though she were offering to help with a simple misunderstanding rather than potentially dismantling their entire assumption about her legal position. "I'll go get the files," she said, her voice still soft but carrying a new note of authority that made Eleanor's eyes narrow with the first flicker of genuine concern. As Margaret walked toward the stairs, she could hear the Walsh family's voices behind her, no longer quite so confident, no longer quite so certain that they held all the cards in this particular game. Margaret returned to the kitchen carrying a leather portfolio that looked far more organized than anything the Walsh family had expected. She moved with quiet confidence, placing the portfolio on the table next to Morrison's folder before taking her seat across from Harold. The casual way she handled the documents suggested this wasn't her first time navigating complex legal territory. Morrison glanced at the portfolio with professional interest, though something in his expression suggested he was beginning to realize this consultation might not proceed as smoothly as Harold had promised. "Mrs. Chun," he said carefully, "what exactly do these documents contain?" Margaret opened the portfolio with practiced ease, revealing sections divided by color-coded tabs and plastic protective sleeves. Each document appeared to be meticulously organized and professionally maintained. "Property records," she said simply, pulling out the first section. "Financing documentation, insurance policies, investment statements. The usual paperwork that accumulates when you purchase and maintain a home over 25 years. Eleanor leaned forward with poorly concealed irritation. "Margaret, dear," she said with strained patience, "I'm sure you've kept careful records of household expenses, but property law is quite complex. These kinds of documents require professional interpretation." She gestured dismissively toward the portfolio. "We don't want to waste Mr. Morrison's time with personal filing systems." Margaret's expression remained serene as she extracted a thick document from the first section. "This is the original purchase agreement from 1998, she said, sliding it across the table to Morrison. "I thought you might find it interesting, particularly the section detailing the source of the down payment." Morrison's eyes widened slightly as he scanned the document. The confidence he'd projected earlier began to evaporate as he read through the financial details. Harold shifted impatiently in his chair, clearly annoyed by the delay. "What exactly are we looking at here?" he demanded, though his voice carried the first hint of uncertainty Margaret had heard all morning. "The down payment for this house was $350,000, Margaret explained calmly, her finger pointing to the relevant line in the contract. "According to this documentation, that money came from the sale of securities held in an individual investment account." She paused, letting the information settle. "My individual investment account." Patricia, who had been examining family photographs in the living room, appeared in the kitchen doorway with a confused expression. "What does that mean exactly?" she asked, though her tone suggested she was beginning to suspect it meant something significant. Margaret reached for another document, this one bearing the official seal of a major brokerage firm. It means I provided the entire down payment for this house using proceeds from investments I'd accumulated during my career in financial planning. She looked directly at Harold, whose face was beginning to show the first signs of genuine alarm. Before I married David, I spent 8 years working for Merrill Lynch, building a portfolio that would eventually allow us to purchase our dream home. Morrison cleared his throat nervously, his eyes moving between the documents and Harold's increasingly tense expression. Mrs. Chun, he said carefully, these records suggest a significantly different financial arrangement than we were initially informed about. He glanced at Harold with something approaching accusation. The preliminary documentation we reviewed didn't indicate any individual asset contributions of this magnitude. Harold's face had gone red, though whether from embarrassment or anger was difficult to determine. That's impossible, he declared, his voice rising slightly. David told us the house was purchased with family money. He specifically said the Walsh family had provided the foundation for the investment. Margaret nodded sympathetically, as though Harold were a confused student rather than a man trying to claim ownership of her property. David did receive a gift from your family, she acknowledged, reaching for another document. $25,000 as a wedding present. It was very generous. She slid a bank statement across the table. That money was used for furniture and the initial landscaping expenses. Eleanor's composure finally cracked. Her voice turned sharp with frustration and something that might have been panic. This is ridiculous, she snapped. David handled all the financial arrangements. He would never have allowed the family home to be purchased with outside money. She glared at Margaret with open hostility. You're obviously confused about the legal arrangements. Margaret's expression remained patient, but something steel-like had entered her voice. I'm not confused, Eleanor. I'm a certified financial planner with 15 years of experience in estate planning and property law. I maintained my professional licenses throughout my marriage specifically so I could manage our family's financial security properly. The silence that followed this revelation was deafening. Morrison stared at Margaret with the dawning realization that he'd been brought in to intimidate someone who probably knew more about financial law than he did. Harold's mouth opened and closed without producing sound, his carefully constructed narrative crumbling with each new piece of documentation. Frank emerged from the basement where he'd been cataloging workshop equipment, oblivious to the tension that had filled the kitchen. Harold, he called out cheerfully, you should see the organization system down there. Everything's labeled and inventoried like a professional operation. Whoever set that up really knew what they were doing. Margaret reached into her portfolio again, this time extracting a thick folder marked with David's workshop inventory. I set up that system, she said quietly. Every tool, every piece of equipment, every supply order. I researched each purchase for months to ensure David had exactly what he needed to pursue his woodworking hobby properly. She opened the folder to reveal detailed receipts, warranty information, and insurance documentation for thousands of dollars worth of equipment. Each item was cross-referenced with purchase dates and maintenance schedules. The level of organization was professional grade, far beyond anything a casual hobbyist would maintain. Morrison was now studying the documents with the intense focus of someone realizing his entire understanding of the situation had been fundamentally wrong. Mrs. Chun, he said slowly, these records indicate a level of financial involvement that significantly changes the legal landscape we're dealing with. He looked up at Harold with barely concealed irritation. The preliminary information I received appears to have been incomplete. Harold's voice had dropped to a dangerous whisper. David never mentioned any of this, he said, though the certainty had completely drained from his tone. He told us the financial arrangements were straightforward family property transfers. Margaret closed the portfolio gently, her movements suggesting this was merely the beginning of what she could produce if necessary. David preferred to let people believe what made them comfortable, she said diplomatically. He thought it was easier than explaining the complexities of our financial partnership. Eleanor stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound. This is absurd, she declared, though her voice carried more desperation than authority now. David would never have kept something this important from his family. She pointed an accusatory finger at Margaret. You're manipulating documents to create some kind of false claim. Margaret's response was delivered with the calm precision of someone accustomed to dealing with hostile clients. Eleanor, she said evenly, These documents are recorded with the county assessor's office, registered with our mortgage company, and documented with our insurance providers. They've been professionally maintained and regularly updated for over 2 decades. She paused, letting the implications sink in. Would you like me to call any of those institutions to verify the information? The offer hung in the air like a challenge that nobody in the room seemed eager to accept. Morrison was frantically making notes in the margins of his legal pad, clearly trying to salvage some credibility from a situation that had spiraled completely beyond his control. Margaret stood gracefully, collecting her documents with the easy confidence of someone who had many more cards left to play. I think we should postpone any discussion about moving timelines until everyone has had a chance to review the complete documentation, she said pleasantly. There are several other aspects of our property ownership that might require clarification before we proceed. The Walsh family exchanged glances filled with growing alarm as Margaret walked toward the stairs, her leather portfolio tucked securely under her arm. The woman they'd dismissed as a grieving widow overwhelmed by financial complexity had just demonstrated a level of legal sophistication that left their entire strategy in ruins. Behind her, she could hear Morrison's voice, no longer confident, asking Harold exactly what other surprises might be waiting in Margaret's files. Margaret returned 20 minutes later carrying a second portfolio, this one even thicker than the first. The Walsh family had spent her absence in tense whispered conversations, their earlier confidence replaced by growing anxiety about what other revelations might be coming. Morrison had been making urgent phone calls, his voice carrying the strained tone of a lawyer trying to manage an increasingly complicated situation. Harold looked up as Margaret settled back into her chair, his face showing the strain of a man whose certainty had been systematically dismantled. "Margaret," he said, his voice attempting to reclaim some authority, "I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding here. Regardless of who provided specific funds, the property has always been considered Walsh family assets. David understood that family investments should benefit family members." Margaret opened the second portfolio with the same methodical precision she'd shown earlier. "Harold," she said gently, "I think you should see the refinancing documents from 2 years ago before we discuss family asset allocation any further." She extracted a substantial document marked with multiple official seals and signatures. This might clarify some of the ownership questions that seemed to be causing confusion. Morrison leaned forward eagerly, clearly hoping these documents would support his client's position more effectively than the previous revelations had. "Mrs. Chun," he said with forced confidence, "refinancing arrangements often involve complex family financial structures that may not be immediately apparent in standard documentation." Margaret handed him the refinancing agreement with a small smile that somehow managed to be both gracious and ominous. "You're absolutely right," she said pleasantly. This refinancing was indeed quite complex. It required extensive documentation of income sources, asset verification, and creditworthiness assessments that the bank insisted on before approving the new terms. Eleanor moved closer to read over Morrison's shoulder, her expensive perfume not quite masking the sharp scent of anxiety that had begun to surround her. "What exactly did this refinancing involve?" she demanded, though her tone suggested she was no longer confident. She wanted to know the answer. Margaret pointed to a section highlighted in yellow on the first page of the agreement. "The refinancing reduced our monthly payments by 37% and eliminated the remaining mortgage balance 18 months early." She paused, allowing Morrison time to process the financial implications. It was only possible because the bank accepted additional collateral to secure the improved terms. Morrison's eyes widened as he read through the collateral documentation. "Mrs. Chun," he said slowly, "this shows additional properties listed as security for the refinancing. Properties that appear to be solely in your name." Patricia, who had been standing near the window pretending to admire the garden, spun around with alarm. "Additional properties," she repeated sharply. "What additional properties?" Margaret reached for another section of the portfolio, her movements calm despite the electric tension filling the room. "I own 2 rental properties in Portland and a commercial building in downtown Vancouver." She extracted property deeds and tax assessments with the casual efficiency of someone discussing routine business matters. "All 3 were purchased with funds from my individual investment accounts before and during my marriage to David." Harold's face had progressed from red to nearly purple. His voice came out as a strangled whisper. David never mentioned any commercial property. He never said anything about rental income or additional real estate investments. Margaret nodded sympathetically. David preferred to focus on his consulting practice rather than manage investment properties. I handled all the real estate transactions, tenant relationships, and property maintenance coordination. She pulled out a thick folder of bank statements showing regular rental income deposits spanning over a decade. It seemed more efficient for me to manage those aspects of our financial portfolio directly. The bank statements told a story that left the Walsh family speechless. Monthly rental income that exceeded most people's full-time salaries. Property appreciation values that had grown into seven-figure assets. Investment returns that painted a picture of sophisticated financial management spanning decades. Frank, who had been sorting through boxes in the living room, appeared in the kitchen doorway carrying a framed certificate. "Margaret," he said uncertainly, "I found this in David's office. It says something about a business partnership." He held up the frame, revealing an official-looking document with both David and Margaret's names prominently displayed. Margaret's expression brightened as though Frank had discovered a pleasant surprise rather than another bombshell. "Oh yes," she said warmly. "That's from the consulting firm David and I established together in 2005. We were equal partners in Walsh-Chun Financial Advisory Services until David decided he preferred working independently." Morrison was now frantically shuffling through papers, clearly trying to find some documentation that would support his client's position instead of further demolishing it. "Mrs. Chun," he said desperately, "these partnership agreements suggest a level of business collaboration that significantly complicates the estate situation. Why wasn't this information included in the preliminary discussions?" Eleanor's voice had risen to near shriek level. "This is impossible," she declared, her composure completely shattered. "David told us he was running his own independent consulting practice. He said he was building something for the Walsh family legacy." Margaret's response was delivered with the gentle patience of someone explaining simple concepts to confused students. "David did build something wonderful," she said kindly. "Our partnership was quite successful before he chose to pursue individual clients exclusively." She extracted another folder, this one containing business formation documents, tax returns, and dissolution paperwork. "When we dissolved the partnership in 2012, David received a settlement of $420,000 for his share of the client base and business assets." Harold slammed his hand down on the table with enough force to make the coffee cups rattle. "Where did that money go?" he demanded, his voice carrying the dangerous edge of a man whose entire worldview was collapsing. "If David received nearly $500,000 from a business partnership, where are those funds?" Margaret pulled out bank statements and investment records with the methodical precision of someone who had anticipated this exact question. "David used those funds to pursue his dream of early retirement," she explained calmly. "He invested in a high-risk venture capital fund that unfortunately lost most of the principal within 18 months. She showed them the devastating account statements that documented the complete loss of David's business settlement. The silence that followed this revelation was broken only by the sound of Morrison's pen frantically scratching across his legal pad as he tried to calculate the implications of everything he'd just learned. When he looked up, his face showed the expression of a lawyer who'd realized he was representing clients in a battle they'd already lost before the first shot was fired. Patricia sank into the nearest chair, her face pale with the dawning recognition that every assumption her family had made about David's financial situation had been completely wrong. "You mean David lost everything?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Margaret's expression showed genuine sympathy for the first time since the conversation had begun. "David took some financial risks that didn't work out the way he'd hoped," she said gently. "But our family was protected because I'd maintained separate investment accounts and property ownership throughout our marriage." She closed the portfolio with finality. The house, the rental properties, and the commercial building were never at risk because they were never part of David's individual financial decisions. Harold stared at her with the stunned expression of a man who'd just discovered he'd brought a butter knife to a gunfight. "You're telling us," he said slowly, "that David had no ownership stake in any significant assets at the time of his death?" Margaret nodded graciously, though her eyes had taken on the sharp focus of someone who'd been underestimated for far too long. I'm telling you that I've been the primary income earner and asset owner in this family for over 20 years, she said quietly. And I have the documentation to prove every single claim I've made. Morrison closed his folder with the defeated gesture of someone who'd realized his services were no longer needed. Mrs. Chun, he said formally, I believe my clients and I need to reassess our understanding of the legal situation before proceeding any further. Margaret stood gracefully, collecting her portfolios with the confident movements of someone who'd just won a battle without raising her voice or losing her composure once. Of course, she said pleasantly. Take all the time you need. I'll be here when you're ready to discuss the real situation instead of the fantasy version you've been operating under. As the Walsh family filed out of her kitchen in stunned silence, Margaret finally allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. 25 years of careful planning and meticulous record-keeping had just paid the most important dividend of her life. The Walsh family returned 3 hours later, their earlier swagger replaced by the grim determination of people who'd spent the morning consulting emergency legal counsel. Morrison looked like he'd aged 5 years during their absence, his expensive suit now wrinkled from stress, and his confident demeanor completely evaporated. Harold's face showed the mottled complexion of a man whose blood pressure had reached dangerous levels. Margaret was waiting for them in the living room, seated comfortably in her favorite chair with a cup of tea and the morning crossword puzzle. She looked up as they filed in with the wary expressions of people approaching a dangerous animal they'd previously mistaken for harmless prey. Eleanor's voice came out tight and controlled, every word carefully measured. Margaret, she said, we've had our attorney review the situation more thoroughly. We may have misunderstood some aspects of the property arrangements. Her admission came through gritted teeth, clearly causing her physical pain to acknowledge. Margaret set down her teacup with gentle precision. I'm glad you've had a chance to get proper legal advice, she said pleasantly. Financial arrangements can be quite complex when families don't communicate clearly about asset ownership and income sources. Harold moved to the center of the room with the aggressive posture of a man trying to salvage some authority from a completely lost cause. Margaret, he said, his voice carrying forced reasonableness, even if there were some irregularities in how we understood the financial arrangements. This house has been the Walsh family home for over 20 years. David considered it part of his legacy to pass on to future generations. Margaret's expression remained serene, but something crystalline had entered her voice. Harold, she said calmly, this house has never been the Walsh family home. It's been my home, purchased with my money, maintained with my income, and improved with my investment decisions. David lived here as my husband, not as the primary owner. She stood gracefully and walked to the mantelpiece where she'd placed a final folder during their absence. This morning's legal consultation was productive, she continued, retrieving documents that looked even more official than anything she'd shown them previously. I contacted the county assessor's office, our insurance company, and our mortgage lender to obtain certified copies of all ownership documentation. Morrison stepped forward reluctantly, clearly hoping against hope that some technicality might save his clients from complete humiliation. Mrs. Chun, he said carefully, while your financial contributions are clearly substantial, property ownership laws are complex. Sometimes legal ownership and practical family arrangements don't align perfectly. Margaret handed him a document bearing multiple official seals and signatures. This is the current deed to this property, she said pleasantly. Note that only one name appears in the ownership section. She pointed to the relevant line where her name stood alone in bold legal text. I hold sole ownership of this house and the 2.7 acres it sits on. Eleanor's voice came out as a strangled whisper. That's impossible, she said, though the fight had clearly gone out of her. David's name was on the mortgage. He talked about the house payments and property taxes like they were his responsibility. Margaret nodded sympathetically. David did help with some household expenses when his consulting income was steady, she acknowledged. But the mortgage has been in my name only since the original purchase. She pulled out additional documents. The property taxes are paid from my business account. The insurance policies list me as the sole policyholder. Every utility bill, every maintenance contract, every improvement invoice has been handled through my personal or business finances for 25 years. Patricia, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally found her voice. "But David always talked about building equity in the family home," she said desperately. "He said the house was his security for retirement planning." Margaret's expression showed genuine sadness for the first time during their confrontations. "David liked to feel like he was contributing to our household security," she explained gently. "I never corrected his public statements because I didn't want to undermine his sense of partnership in our marriage. But the legal reality has always been that this property represents my individual investment and ownership." Frank emerged from the kitchen where he'd apparently been making phone calls, his face showing the defeated expression of someone who'd just confirmed bad news. "Harold," he said quietly, "I called our real estate contact to ask about comparable property values in this neighborhood." He looked at Margaret with something approaching respect. "This property is currently assessed at $2.8 million. The figure hung in the air like a physical blow. Harold's mouth opened and closed without producing sound as the full magnitude of his miscalculation became clear. Morrison stared at Margaret with the odd expression of someone who'd just realized he tried to intimidate a multi-millionaire property owner into giving up her home to people with no legal claim whatsoever. Margaret returned to her chair with the calm authority of someone whose position could no longer be questioned. "Harold," she said kindly, "I understand this is difficult to process. David's stories about family property and Walsh Investments made everyone feel included in something larger than themselves. But the truth is that I've been the sole financial foundation for David's lifestyle and security throughout our entire marriage." Eleanor's composure finally shattered completely. Her voice rose to a near shriek as 25 years of condescension and dismissal came crashing down around her. "You let us believe David was successful," she screamed. "You let us think he was providing for you instead of the other way around. You manipulated our entire family for decades." Margaret's response was delivered with the steel wrapped in silk that had characterized her entire performance. "Eleanor," she said quietly, "I never told your family anything false about our financial arrangements. You assumed that David was the primary breadwinner because that fit your preconceptions about marriage roles and ethnic hierarchies. I simply never corrected assumptions that made David feel more comfortable with his family." Harold slumped into the nearest chair, his face showing the gray pallor of a man whose entire worldview had just collapsed. "You're telling us that David had no assets, no property ownership, no significant income at the time of his death," he said slowly. Margaret nodded with genuine sympathy. "David's estate consists of his personal possessions, his car, and approximately $43,000 in checking and savings accounts." She paused, letting the modest figure settle against their earlier assumptions of wealth and property ownership. "Everything else you've seen here represents my individual assets, accumulated through my career and investment decisions." Morrison closed his briefcase with the finality of someone abandoning a hopeless cause. "Mrs. Chun," he said formally, "I need to advise my clients that they have no legal standing to claim any interest in this property or its contents." He looked at Harold with barely concealed irritation. The consultation they requested was based on fundamentally incorrect information about the ownership situation. Margaret stood again, her movement signaling that the discussion had reached its conclusion. "I appreciate everyone's time today," she said graciously. "I know this has been difficult information to process. But I hope you can understand that I need to begin planning my own future now, in the home that I've worked so hard to create and maintain." Eleanor's voice came out small and defeated. "What about David's things?" she asked desperately. "His clothes, his personal items, the family photographs?" Margaret's expression softened slightly. "Of course you're welcome to David's personal belongings," she said kindly. "I've already set aside everything that has sentimental value for your family. But the furniture, artwork, and household items will be staying with the house since they represent my personal taste and investment decisions over the years." Harold looked up at her with the stunned recognition of someone who'd just realized he was standing in a stranger's home, uninvited and unwelcome. "We need to leave," he said quietly, his voice carrying the hollow tone of complete defeat. Margaret nodded graciously. "I think that would be best," she agreed. "You're welcome to return tomorrow to collect David's personal items, but I'd appreciate if you could call first to arrange a convenient time." As the Walsh family gathered their belongings and prepared to leave her home, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in 25 years of marriage. complete authority over her own space, her own decisions, and her own future. The woman they dismissed as a powerless widow had just reclaimed control of everything that had always belonged to her. The next morning brought an early spring rain that drummed against the windows of Margaret's home as she prepared her final surprise for the Walsh family. She'd spent the evening making phone calls to attorneys, accountants, and old colleagues, setting in motion the legal mechanisms that would ensure this situation never repeated itself with any other family members who might emerge with unfounded claims. Harold arrived first, driving his aging Cadillac with the defeated posture of a man who'd lost everything he thought he understood about his son's life. Eleanor sat rigid in the passenger seat, her face showing the pinched expression of someone who'd spent the night processing 25 years of completely incorrect assumptions. Behind them, Patricia and Frank followed in their sedan, clearly reluctant participants in what they now understood would be a humiliating surrender. Margaret watched them park from her kitchen window, noting how they hesitated before approaching her front door. Yesterday's confident invasion had been replaced by the uncertain movements of people who finally understood they were trespassing on someone else's property. When the doorbell rang, she took her time answering, allowing them to stand in the rain long enough to appreciate their changed circumstances. Harold looked terrible. His expensive suit couldn't hide the fact that he'd aged a decade overnight, his face gray with the strain of a man whose pride had been systematically demolished. Eleanor's perfectly styled hair showed the effects of a sleepless night, and her usual arrogant bearing had collapsed into something approaching shame. "Margaret," Harold said, his voice barely above a whisper, "we've come to collect David's personal belongings as you suggested. We won't take long." The authority that had characterized his speech for decades had completely evaporated, leaving behind the uncertain tone of someone asking permission in a situation where he held no power. Margaret stepped aside graciously, allowing them entry into what they now understood was entirely her home. "Of course," she said pleasantly. "I've organized everything in the guest room upstairs. David's clothes, his books, his sports memorabilia, and the family photographs that include Walsh relatives." She gestured toward the stairs with the casual authority of someone directing guests in her own space. As they climbed the stairs, Margaret noticed Eleanor examining the artwork and furnishings with the new understanding that everything around her represented Margaret's personal taste and financial investment. The Chinese silk paintings that Eleanor had always dismissed as ethnic decoration were actually museum-quality pieces that Margaret had inherited from her grandmother's collection. The furniture that Eleanor had mentally cataloged for Walsh family distribution was comprised of hand-picked antiques that Margaret had acquired during business trips throughout Asia and Europe. Patricia emerged from the guest room carrying a small box, her movements careful and apologetic. "Margaret," she said quietly, "we found some business awards and certificates in David's desk. We weren't sure if these had family significance or if they were related to his work with you." Margaret examined the items with interest, recognizing several awards that David had received for projects they'd completed together during their partnership years. "These are from our consulting firm," she explained gently. "David was very proud of the recognition our work received. You're welcome to keep them as reminders of his professional accomplishments." The gesture was perfectly calculated generosity, emphasizing both her ownership of their shared success and her willingness to be gracious in victory. Eleanor accepted the box with trembling hands, clearly struggling with the reality that Margaret was giving them permission to keep mementos of achievements that had apparently been Margaret's as much as David's. Frank appeared in the hallway carrying David's golf clubs, his face showing the awkward embarrassment of someone who'd spent yesterday inventorying property that had never belonged to his family. "Margaret," he said uncomfortably, "David always said these clubs were a gift from his father. Should we?" Harold's voice cut through Frank's uncertainty with bitter resignation. "Take them," he said roughly. Everything David told us about gifts and family contributions was apparently as fictional as everything else. He looked at Margaret with the defeated expression of someone acknowledging a superior opponent. "We clearly don't understand what was real and what David invented to make himself feel better about his situation." Margaret's response was delivered with the diplomatic precision of someone who could afford to be generous in complete victory. "Harold," she said kindly, "David loved your family very much. He wanted you to see him as successful and capable of providing security for our household. The stories he told weren't meant to deceive anyone. They were meant to preserve his dignity in a marriage where the traditional roles had been reversed. Eleanor looked up from the box she was packing with something approaching desperation. "But why didn't you ever correct us?" she asked, her voice cracking slightly. "All these years, you let us treat you like David was doing you some kind of favor by marrying you. You let us act like you were the fortunate one in the relationship." Margaret considered the question with the thoughtful expression of someone who'd spent decades navigating complex family dynamics. "Eleanor," she said finally, "correcting your assumptions would have required me to embarrass David in front of his family. I chose to protect his pride rather than assert my own achievements." She paused, letting the implications settle. Perhaps that was a mistake, but it seemed kinder at the time. The admission hung in the air like a masterclass in gracious superiority. Margaret had just revealed that her 25 years of apparent submission had actually been a deliberate choice to protect David's masculinity and preserve family harmony. The woman they dismissed as weak and foreign had been strong enough to sacrifice recognition of her own success for the sake of someone else's emotional comfort. Harold slumped against the wall, his face showing the full weight of understanding how completely he'd misjudged everything about his daughter-in-law. "You could have corrected us any time," he said slowly. "You could have put us in our place years ago." Margaret's smile held just a hint of steel beneath its gracious surface. "Harold," she said quietly, "I didn't need to put you in your place years ago. But circumstances have changed now, and it's become necessary for everyone to understand the actual situation rather than the comfortable fiction we've all been maintaining." The sound of vehicles arriving outside drew everyone's attention to the windows. Margaret looked down to see a moving truck pulling into the driveway, followed by two cars she didn't immediately recognize. She checked her watch with satisfaction. "Right on time." Eleanor's voice carried a note of panic. "Margaret," she said urgently, "we're not finished packing David's things yet. We didn't realize you'd scheduled movers today." Margaret's expression remained serene as she walked toward the stairs. "The movers aren't here for David's belongings," she explained calmly. "They're here to remove the items that the Walsh family brought into my home yesterday, without permission." She paused at the top of the stairs, looking back at the family with gentle authority. "I've also invited a few neighbors to witness the removal process, just to ensure everything is handled properly." The Walsh family followed her downstairs with growing alarm, realizing that Margaret's planning had extended far beyond simply proving her ownership of the property. Through the front windows, they could see several neighbors gathering on the sidewalk, including Helen Morrison from next door and the Johnsons from across the street. Word had apparently spread through the neighborhood about yesterday's dramatic confrontation. Margaret opened the front door to greet the moving crew supervisor, a professional-looking woman who consulted her clipboard efficiently. "Mrs. Chun," she said formally, "we're here to remove the boxes and personal items that were brought onto your property without authorization yesterday. Our instructions are to return everything to the vehicles that brought them here." Harold's face went from gray to deep red as the full humiliation of his situation became clear. "You're having us escorted off the property," he said, his voice mixing anger with disbelief. Margaret's response was delivered with the calm authority of someone stating simple facts. "Harold," she said pleasantly, "yesterday you brought moving boxes and packing materials onto my property based on the false assumption that you had legal rights here. Today I'm simply ensuring that your belongings are returned to you in an organized fashion." She gestured toward the neighbors who were watching with undisguised interest. "I thought it would be helpful to have witnesses to confirm that this process is being handled respectfully and legally." Eleanor realized that their private family humiliation was about to become a very public neighborhood spectacle. "Margaret," she said desperately, "surely we can handle this more privately. There's no need to involve the entire neighborhood in family business." Margaret tilted her head thoughtfully, as though considering a reasonable request from someone in a position to negotiate. "Eleanor," she said gently, "yesterday you were quite comfortable discussing my legal position and living arrangements in front of strangers when you brought your attorney here to intimidate me." She smiled with crystalline politeness. "I thought you'd appreciate the same level of transparency for today's proceedings." Helen Morrison approached from the sidewalk, her face showing the satisfaction of someone who'd never particularly liked the Walsh family's superior attitude. "Margaret," she called out, "is everything all right here? We heard there was some confusion about property ownership yesterday." Margaret's response carried perfectly to the assembled neighbors. "Everything is fine, Helen," she said clearly. "We've just had some misunderstandings about who owns what, but the legal documentation has clarified the situation completely." She looked directly at Harold as she continued. "It turns out that some assumptions about family property were incorrect, and we're correcting those misunderstandings today." The moving crew began efficiently loading the Walsh family's belongings while the neighbors watched with growing understanding. Patricia whispered urgently to Eleanor, trying to convince her to leave before the situation became even more embarrassing, but Eleanor seemed frozen by the magnitude of her miscalculation. Frank attempted to salvage some dignity by addressing Margaret directly. "We appreciate your patience with this situation," he said formally. "We clearly misunderstood the legal arrangements, and we apologize for any inconvenience our assumptions may have caused." Margaret accepted his apology with gracious authority. "Frank," she said kindly, "family situations can be complex, and financial arrangements aren't always what they appear to be from the outside. I'm sure everyone was operating based on the information they thought was accurate." Harold stood beside his loaded car, his face showing the hollow expression of a man whose entire understanding of his family's status had been permanently shattered. "Margaret," he said quietly, one final attempt at dignity, "I need to ask you directly. Did David know about all of this? Did he understand that you were supporting him rather than the other way around?" Margaret's answer was delivered with gentle honesty that somehow made it even more devastating. "David knew exactly what our financial arrangement was, Harold," she said softly. "He asked me not to discuss it with family members because he was embarrassed about not being the traditional breadwinner." She paused, allowing the implications to settle completely. "I honored his request because I loved him, even though it meant allowing your family to treat me as though I were the dependent one in our marriage." The revelation that David had been complicit in the deception that had enabled years of condescension toward Margaret left Harold speechless. Eleanor simply stared at her former daughter-in-law with the stunned expression of someone realizing that every interaction they'd ever had was based on completely false premises. As the Walsh family's cars disappeared down the street, Margaret stood in her doorway receiving congratulations and support from neighbors who were finally learning the truth about the quiet woman they'd underestimated for decades. Helen Morrison shook her head in amazement. "Margaret," she said warmly, "I had no idea you owned rental properties and commercial real estate. David always made it sound like he was the business owner in your family." Margaret's response was diplomatic but clear. "David preferred to let people draw their own conclusions about our roles," she explained. "It seemed easier than constantly correcting assumptions about who was responsible for what in our household." 3 months later, Margaret had transformed her life completely. The house that the Walsh family had tried to claim was now the center of a social circle that appreciated her intelligence, her professional accomplishments, and her generous spirit. She'd reconnected with colleagues from her financial planning career and was considering returning to work part-time, helping other women navigate complex estate planning and property ownership issues. The rental properties were generating more income than she needed for comfortable living, so she'd established a scholarship fund for first-generation college students pursuing business degrees. The commercial building in downtown Vancouver was being renovated to house a nonprofit organization supporting women entrepreneurs. Every decision she made reflected her values rather than someone else's expectations of appropriate behavior. Margaret's story had spread throughout their social community, becoming a cautionary tale about making assumptions based on gender roles and ethnic stereotypes. She'd become something of a local legend, the quiet woman who'd built an investment empire while everyone assumed her husband was the successful one. Women sought her advice about protecting their assets in marriage. Financial advisors referred clients who needed sophisticated estate planning guidance. The garden that Eleanor had dismissed as Margaret's simple hobby was actually a carefully designed landscape, incorporating rare varieties she'd collected during business trips throughout Asia. The artwork that the Walsh family had mentally cataloged as ethnic decoration was worth more than most people's retirement accounts. Even the furniture they'd planned to redistribute among family members represented a collection of antiques and custom pieces that reflected decades of discriminating taste and substantial investment. Margaret had never needed the Walsh family's approval or acceptance. She'd simply chosen to prioritize harmony over recognition, protecting David's pride at the cost of her own acknowledgement. Once that consideration was removed, her true position in the world became impossible to ignore or dismiss. On quiet evenings, she sat in the living room that was entirely her own creation, sipping tea from porcelain her grandmother had brought from China decades earlier, reading books she'd chosen from her private library, surrounded by beauty she'd carefully curated over years of patient accumulation. The woman the Walsh family had tried to evict from her own home was exactly where she belonged, in possession of everything she'd earned through intelligence, hard work, and careful planning. The house they'd claimed as family property would remain Margaret's sanctuary, a testament to what's possible when someone builds their security on actual assets rather than assumptions and entitlement. And if you've made it this far in Margaret's incredible journey, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to deal with family members who underestimated your capabilities? How do you think Margaret handled the situation? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about people who refuse to let others define their worth.